Having given no one any excuse, having made it clear that everyone stands absolutely guilty before God, we then come to chapter 3, verse 24. And that word "but" must be one of the greatest words in the whole Bible. No, one of the biggest buts. But now, glorious, but now. And notice this, apart from law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Christ Jesus for all who believe. After chapter 1, 2 and the first part of 3, the big question is, after all of that, how can a guilty sinner get right with a holy God? How can we come into a right relationship with a holy God? How are we right? How can we become righteous? This really, after chapters 1, 2 and 3, this is the burning question. We're absolutely guilty. And we are guilty because we have broken the law. Whether it's the law of Moses, whether it's the law written on our hearts, or whether it's the law that is written on our hearts and identified because we condemn others but do the same thing. How do we get right with God? And these verses that follow here now are, to me, absolutely amazing. Because it's not just a matter of God forgiving us. How can God forgive guilty people and remain righteous? Let's just imagine a law court. Let's imagine a judge. I'm sure this wouldn't happen, but let's just, for the sake of the illustration, imagine you have a judge, and there in the dock is his son, and the son, it is absolutely certain that he's guilty, no doubt about it, and the judge looks at him and says, I know you're guilty, but I'm going to declare you not guilty. You can go. The problem with that is the judge then is guilty, because that's injustice. That's what corrupt judges do. Corrupt judges let guilty people go free. And so the big question is, how can God, who is a just God, declare a guilty sinner righteous? This is the burning question. And what we see in these next verses is a declaration of how God has done that. But now, apart from law, that is not by means of the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed, has been made known, has been declared, and is attested by the law and the prophets. In other words, Paul is saying here, what I'm going to say now is not new, it's not novel, it's something that is rooted in the Old Testament. It's something that has been declared beforehand. It is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Christ Jesus Christ for all who believe. In other words, it is possible for people to know the righteousness of God. In other words, be declared righteous. Not declared a sinner, but declared righteous. And this righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus. So that compares to law, because it is apart from law. It's a different way. Before, we've seen how we're guilty because we've broken law. But now there's a way that we can be declared right with God that is not by law, it is by faith in Jesus. And it's for all who believe. For there is no distinction. See? No distinction between Jew and Gentile. Since all, Jew and Gentile, have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, they are now justified by His graces of gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by His blood, effective through faith. Now, this is just a massive lot there. And what I want to do is go back and just try and unpack it a little bit for you. When we read these words, justification, redemption, sacrifice of atonement, what we read are theological words. These are the words that theologians talk over. You go to a dictionary of theology and you'll find justification, you have pages to read, and redemption, there's pages to read. But let's go back to what I said right at the beginning, is that when the Apostle Paul wrote this, he actually wrote it for normal people. And when you read these words, what I want to suggest to you is that Paul wasn't writing a theological word. He was actually giving a picture. He was using words from their everyday life and using those as illustrations. The other thing I want to say is when it comes to the gospel is so big that there's no one word that would illustrate it. The apostle uses different, what I call picture words, to try and communicate what the gospel is. And so the word justified there, that we're introduced to in verse 24, that word actually comes from the law court. And it's appropriate because that's what he's been talking about. He's been talking about people who are guilty under the law, have broken the law. And so the word that would be really appropriate would be a word from that setting. And so for us it may be a theological word. For the readers who read this, it would have been from their everyday life. And this is what this word means. If we have that picture that I just painted of a judge and someone there who's in the dock, someone who's been condemned, you know, you go through the trial, you have the prosecution and defence, and they do their bit, and at the end, the judge will make a pronouncement. Are they guilty or are they innocent? And if the judge considers that that person is innocent, the word that they would use is that person is justified. That person is declared not guilty. So it's a legal word. They are justified. If they were guilty, then they are condemned. You see, justified is opposite to condemned. And so at the end of chapter 3 verse 20, we know that we're pretty much condemned. But now God has found a way apart from the law, separate from the law, and it is the righteousness of God. It has been made known. It's founded on the Old Testament, and it is through faith in Christ Jesus for all who believe. No distinction between Jew and Gentile. It is for everyone. And what it is, we are now declared not guilty. We are justified by His grace. Grace, of course, is something that can't be purchased. It's not worked for. It's freely given by God, and of course that has to be the case because we're all guilty. We are declared justified, not guilty, by His grace. It is a gift. That is kind of in a sense, a repetition, because grace has to be a gift. So it's kind of an emphasis. His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Now, with the word redemption, we have another picture word. And for the first readers of this letter, the word redemption is connected to the slave market. It's connected to Israel's history when they were delivered from Egypt, of course, freed from slavery. But locally, it would have been the slave market. And if you get this picture, someone who stands there in the slave market, they are owned, they're being sold, and you have someone who comes up and they says, how much does this person cost? And they're told how much it is. They pay the money, and then they turn to that slave and say, you are now free. You've been purchased and you are free. I'm releasing you. They have been redeemed. And so we get these glorious pictures of what the gospel means. Justified by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward. Now I want you to know the ESV, what this word is in verse 25. Through whom God put forward as... What does it say? Could you read verse 25?
Yeah. Whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sin.
Okay, that's very interesting. The New RSV says, whom God put forward as a sacrifice for atonement. The word actually is more accurate in the New RSV. The reason why it's not often used is because it's a bit of an awkward word. The word propitiation, which is a kind of a technical word, it talks about appeasing, at one level, it talks about appeasing the wrath of the gods. If you're talking about idolatry, it's about appeasing the wrath of the gods. Now, some people feel very awkward to feel that that this word would be used of God. But I want to draw your attention how we've seen in chapter 1 verse 18, the first thing it says is the wrath of God that has been made known. And the question is, how does a holy God declare a guilty sinner not guilty and still remain righteous? And the answer is because of the work of Jesus, the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice or of atonement or a propitiation by his blood. And so the way this works is that the wrath of God was put on Jesus. Now, people today feel really uncomfortable with that. I've even heard people who write about this and say that's awful, that means God's involved in child abuse, you know. But we need to remember the Trinity. We need to remember how in 2 Corinthians 5, it was God who was at work in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. In other words, the wrath of God was absorbed even in his own very being. And the fact is that we can be declared not guilty because God did not say, it's okay, you can go free, I'm not going to judge you, but rather the judgment of God was borne by his Son. In other words, we were not simply let off. The price for our sin was paid. And because the price for our sin was paid, we can be declared not guilty. And God remains just. I hope you get that. This is just an amazing thing. God has found a way to declare guilty people not guilty. and remain just. And he did it because the price of sin was paid by himself, by his Son, as he hung on that tree. Now, this is what is called technically a substitutionary atonement. And this again in some circles today is becoming unpopular for the similar reasons that I've said. But let's just go back to Leviticus. We see this rooted in the Old Testament, as Paul said there. The law and the prophets bear witness to this. You've read Leviticus. I'm sure you memorized it.
All the way.
As part of your studies. You see, when God gave Moses the worship system for the Old Testament, what Christ was going to do was already foreshadowed here. Because, Leviticus is basically the priest's handbook, isn't it? Exodus finishes with the tabernacle, being made, and the glory of the Lord fills it. Well, the next obvious thing is the priests need to know what to do that are going to work in the tabernacle. So the next thing you get is Leviticus. And it's a priest's handbook. And it talks about the different sacrifices. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, this is chapter 1 verse 3, you shall offer a male without blemish. You shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance on your behalf before the Lord. See, right there. This animal is going to be accepted on your behalf. You shall lay your hands on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be acceptable on your behalf as an atonement for you. And then the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. And Aaron's sons the priest shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up in all its parts, and the sons of the priest Aaron shall put fire on the altar and rearrange the wood on the fire, etc. And so the sacrifice here in the Old Testament, when someone brought an animal, there was this ritual. And according to the rabbis, what they would do is they would lay their hands on the animal and they would confess their sins over it, and then they would take a knife and they would slit the throat of the animal from ear to ear, and the priest would hold a bowl and they would catch the blood. Now, I'm sure it wasn't all nice and gentle like that. You have a bull. Bulls don't really want to be killed, So I'm sure it was. You had to be kind of beefy and strong and tie them up. But basically, the animal was cut and they caught the blood. And as the blood poured out of that animal's throat into that bowl, the offerer realised that it should have been them. They were the ones that should have been dying, and that animal was dying in their place. See, this was the background of the sacrifices, and that is why Paul could speak so confidently in Romans by saying what God has done has been attested, has already been in the law and in the prophets. Because when you come to Isaiah 53, you read Isaiah 53, it is clear that the prophet Isaiah is speaking there about the servant of the Lord that was going to come. And his death was going to be on behalf of the people. And so when he says these things, they're just remarkable. Because God has found a way for guilty people to be declared righteous and to be put forward as a propitiation. And so it's not only has the price of their sin been paid, but the anger of God has been appeased too. That wrath of God we read about has been dealt with. And We know this because of chapter 5. Verse 9, much more surely now that we have been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life. And so the answer to the dilemma of chapter 1, 2 and the first part of verse 3 we see in these verses. God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, effective through faith. You see, it's not by law, it's apart from law, it's now by faith, placing their faith in Christ. It's a whole new way of righteousness. God did this to show his righteousness because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins of previously committed. And it was to prove that at this present time that he is himself is righteous and that he justifies the one who has faith in Jesus. Now, the work of Jesus, Paul is saying, not only does it reach forward, but it actually also reaches back. Because those animals that were sacrificed by the people there, they actually couldn't take away sin. They were pointing forward to something. And that was, of course, was Jesus. And it's as if when Jesus died on that cross, all of those credit notes from those sacrifices were paid. And this is what he says, that he passed over sins previously committed. But that was because there was going to become one that would die and pay the price for those sins. So what has become of our boasting? It is excluded. By what law? By that of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. For is God the God of the Jew only? Is he not the God of the Gentile also? Yes, the Gentile also, since God is one, and he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faith, and the uncircumcised through the same faith. Do then we overthrow this law by faith? By this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Now that may seem to be a little bit of a contradiction, but what he's saying is the gospel doesn't mean we become lawless. See, that isn't the outcome, and he's going to unpack that later on, as we will see in chapter 6 following. But here he's stressing again that this justification that's by faith is for Jew and Gentile. Like verse after verse, he's emphasizing it is for the same. We all are justified, Jew or Gentile, through faith in Christ.